Medieval punishments for modern times. Looking back at the past, most of us find comfort in the fact that many of the most savage customs, traditions, and rituals of our ancestors no longer exist. Perhaps the most relieving is that many of the goriest and messiest of the devices and methods used for punishment, like the horrific blood eagle disembowelment process, have died out. Rather terrifyingly, however, a number of these medieval practices are still around today, and some are even endorsed by governments that usually champion human rights. Flogging. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, flogging typically involved exposing a wrongdoer's upper half and suspending them by the wrists on a wooden post. With their bare back extra taut and so more susceptible to pain, the offender was brutally lashed 20 or more times depending on the severity of the crime. If the victim fainted during the ordeal, either from loss of blood or shock, the flogging was paused and a bucket of water splashed in their face to restore consciousness, after which it resumed. Flogging was a regular occurrence in Europe, and it was usually reserved for those who stole, cheated, or were drunk in public, such as at Durham in 1690, when a married woman named Eleanor Wilson was given a lashing after being caught drunk on a Sunday. From the 20th century, this excruciating punishment disappeared from Europe, but it is unfortunately still practiced in many Muslim countries today, such as Indonesia, Iran, Singapore, and the Maldives. In Saudi Arabia, one of the most infamous cases involved blogger Raif Badawi, who in 2014 was sentenced to a grueling 1,000 lashes for criticizing Islam online, while a Filipino man was handed 75 lashes for accidentally bringing into the country 2 chocolate bars with alcohol inside them. Decapitation. Lopping off the heads of villains and crooks is about as old as time itself, but the most enduring image of this macabre measure came from the late 18th century. The guillotine, which cut heads swiftly using a sharp angled blade dropped from a height, gained international notoriety during the French Revolution, yet older methods were not so humane. From as early as 1066, when William the Conqueror beheaded troublemaking Norman nobles, decapitation was the preferred way to go for European aristocrats. But it was in no way quick, with the French brandishing the sword and the English and Germans favoring the axe. Executions were often gruesomely drawn-out affairs, such as those performed by James II headsman Jack Ketch, who was well-renowned for taking 3 or 4 slashes to finish the job. Nowadays, decapitation is still carried out in Saudi Arabia, where most recently in November 2022, 12 people were beheaded by the sword in 10 days, and it's also the chosen method of execution by Islamic State militants. One of the most egregious examples was when 27 hostages lost their lives in this grisly manner at the hands of 4 radicals dubbed the Beatles because of their British accents. Crucifixion. Even before Jesus was strung on the cross, crucifixion was a very popular punitive choice. In the ancient world, it was most infamously wielded as a punishment against the perpetrators of a slave revolt led by former gladiator Spartacus in 71 BC. After it was put down, Roman legionnaire Crassus crucified around 6,000 participants, lining them across the Appian Way for maximum psychological effect. Later on in the 16th century, it was commonly employed by the Japanese against Christians, such as in 1597, when 26 were nailed to a cross in Nagasaki. While in 1651, many non-Christians suffered the same fate after an unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the ruling shogun. Today, this barbaric punishment is still carried out in Sudan, where it's permitted under Sharia law. In 2013, 3 men found guilty of murder were sentenced to hanging and then public crucifixion, in accordance with Article 168 of the 1991 Sudanese Penal Code. Curiously, because of its religious undertones, crucifixion has also been used in the modern age as a form of protest to recall the suffering of Jesus. In 2013, 8 bus drivers from Paraguay hammered themselves to a cross to show their disdain for their employer, who fired them after they asked for overtime pay and other basic work benefits. Immolation. Being burnt at the stake was a classic medieval punishment, typically meted out to women believed to be witches, or most memorably, Joan of Arc in 1431 in Rouen, France, branded as heretics by Christian inquisitors. Immolation was officially sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church in 1184 as the punishment for heresy, since it was widely believed that the victim would have no body to enter the afterlife, condemning them to eternal purgatory instead. Tied to a stake and set ablaze, in large fires, the victims usually died from carbon monoxide poisoning rather than immolation. But those unfortunate enough to be ignited by smaller fires could survive for up to 2 hours, eventually succumbing to either heat stroke, shock, loss of blood, or passing away after their vital organs had thermally decomposed. There were many horrific variations of this grotesque ceremony, such as the addition of a rope tied around the victim's neck that would strangle them at the same time as they were being incinerated. While in Germany, religious zealots placed burning lumps of sulfur under the armpits of suspected witches, creating a blaze which even water cannot extinguish, which made light work of them. Amazingly, the practice of witch hunting still continues in parts of Africa, such as in Kenya, where in 2008, 11 elderly people were burnt to a crisp after an angry mob were convinced they were all evil warlocks or sorceresses. Blinding. Removing the eyes of offenders was a punishment doled out by innumerable bygone civilizations. Instituted in 303 by Emperor Diocletian, the Byzantines were particularly enthusiastic practitioners, gouging out the eyes of early Christians with either a red-hot iron dagger, tent peg, or nail which was plunged into the iris. Elsewhere, Basil II, a later Byzantine monarch of the 10th century, infamously blinded thousands of Bulgarian renegades. He made sure that a man for every 100 remained with one eye so that they could lead them to the king of the Bulgars who, upon seeing the nightmarish remnants, supposedly died of shock instantly. In modern times, although rare, blinding is still legally permitted in Iran under a law in which the victim has the power to decide whether the assailant should have their eyes taken out. In a literal interpretation of the old maxim, an eye for an eye, in March 2015, Iranian medics gouged out an eye of a convict with the express permission of his victim, who was made sightless by an acid attack. Another example happened at a crackdown on protests that erupted in the Kashmir region in 2016, when the Indian Armed Forces intentionally blinded up to 500 demonstrators, including children as young as 4, by firing small metal pellets into the faces of unarmed youths, causing partial or full loss of sight for many. Castration. Castration has featured heavily throughout the ages, for ritual reasons such as for the goddess Ishtar 6,000 years ago, and to deter crimes, as seen in the 9th century reign of King Alfred of England, and Jefferson's 18th century Virginia laws. It could also be used to assert authority over another party, like in 1144, when the Duke of Normandy in the north of what is now France ordered the castration of the Bishop of Sieyès and several of his entourage after they elected him as bishop without his consent. The missing parts were subsequently presented to the Duke on a platter. Yet, interestingly enough, it wasn't always used in a punitive way, and in some cases, non-criminals were even encouraged to go under the knife. From the 16th century, highly prized singers known as castrati had their nether regions purposefully removed in boyhood, often at the bidding of their own parents, so they could retain the highness of their prepubescent voices as adults. A lack of testosterone meant the singer's bones didn't harden, resulting in unusually large rib cages which enabled them to hold notes for an extremely long duration. Surprisingly, many Western countries such as Canada, Sweden, Germany, Norway, and Denmark, and several U.S. states including Georgia, Iowa, Louisiana, and Texas, to name a few, have laws that permit forced chemical castration on abusers. Although requiring consent, the Czech Republic remains the only EU state to perform therapeutic surgical castrations, but this has been heavily criticized by human rights groups, who argue that patients are sometimes coerced into making this choice, since refusal can lead to longer-term detention. So, it seems the medieval world is still alive and well, although that can't be said for the many people unlucky enough to have come into contact with it today.
Penal colony punishments. Australia. 18th through the 19th century. During the late 18th century and the mid-19th century, British criminals were transported to various penal colonies in Australia. Discipline was harshly enforced by the military guards for convicts who were lazy or unruly at their jobs. Let's look at some of the punishments used on convicts. Solitary confinement. For committing minor crimes such as being disrespectful to authorities, a convict would be placed in solitary confinement in dark, dumb cells. They would be placed in a small cell that was pitch black because there were no windows to let light in. Sitting in absolute silence for weeks and fed minimal rations of bread and water, it was believed that this would give convicts time to reflect on their behavior and rehabilitate. Leg irons. Penal colonies had no restrictive walls in the early years, but only the most brave or foolish of convicts would attempt to escape. They would encounter the bush, a wilderness they could not survive. And if they did try to escape, they would be tracked by the Aboriginal tribesmen working willingly or unwillingly for the penal colony. After several escape attempts, heavy shackles were introduced to prevent runaways. They were placed around the ankles of the convict, and sometimes they were connected in a gang, as they did hard labor such as building roads, bridges, courthouses, hospitals, or working on government farms. Leg irons were extremely heavy and uncomfortable to wear, rubbing against the ankles, and were left on for months as the convict worked. Convicts placed leather between the leg iron and their ankles, if they could find it, to stop the excruciating pain. There was no key to release them either. When they were fastened to the ankle, a rivet was placed in the lock and heated up. The only way to take them off was for the blacksmith to hammer the rivet out. The treadmill. First introduced at Carter's Barracks, Sydney, in 1823 to punish insolence, the treadmill would see the convict walk on a revolving set of steps that turned a wheel. They would walk for 40 minutes, with 20 minutes rest, and could be flogged if they didn't keep up the pace. The dust created from the treadmill irritated their eyes and lungs, and if they slipped, their legs might be shredded by the blades below. The treadmill would power a mill which would grind grain into flour, therefore having the added productive element to the punishment. It would produce food for the convicts and for sale to the public. Flogging. Prisoners who were lazy, disobeyed orders, or did not do their work at all would be flogged. This brutal punishment involved a cat-o'-nine tails, which had lead attached to each strand, which was used to whip the convict's back. The flogging would be done publicly outside as a warning to others. The flogging itself would be done by a strong convict called scourgers, with a drummer keeping the pace. Scourgers were paid 3 shillings and 6 pence per day by the government and were naturally unpopular with the other convicts. They slept in their own part of the barracks away from others. A doctor would also be present because of how deadly flogging was. After a couple of lashes, the skin would break. 50 lashes could turn them into a bloody mess. It could go up to 100 lashes, which could kill the convict. Another downside of flogging was that it could incapacitate the convict, making it difficult to work. This sometimes caused them to be flogged again for the same crime. The superintendent could not order this punishment. Instead, it had to be approved by the magistrate of the court or by the governor. Female punishments. For women, punishment for drunkenness or theft would see them sent to the factories, where they could be made to work for years manufacturing clothes and washing them. In the factory, being disrespectful would see them having their head shaved or placed in solitary confinement. Outside of the factories, the authorities felt free to use the same punishments that men received. Sometimes the punishments, which were excessive for the crimes committed, had the effect of changing the morality of the convict. Other times, the punishments, such as flogging, had the opposite effect, because the convict desired revenge, or the punishment made them less productive because of the severeness of the punishment.
Swine and punishment. The pigs tried for murder in medieval France, 1200 to 1750. Over 500 years ago, the small French village of Savigny was rocked by a horrific tragedy. Unaware of the coming danger, a 5-year-old boy happily played alone in the street. But then, out of nowhere, a group of attackers accosted the young child, tearing off his head and arms without hesitation. It was broad daylight, and the bold killers made no attempt to conceal their crime. It sounds like something out of a TV detective drama, except for one striking feature. The perpetrators were pigs. Specifically, the ringleader was a sow, accompanied by her 6 piglets. The villagers were naturally appalled by the horrible event, but it didn't end there. All 7 pigs were arrested and put through a criminal trial as if they were human beings. Although the pig's owner was initially arrested too, the judge ruled that he was not liable for the pig's action. That left just the pigs to be indicted for murder. They were kept in prison while awaiting trial. After all, the village didn't want a murderous gang on the loose. The entire process played out exactly how it would have in a human trial, with attorneys arguing for the defense and prosecution. The piglets got off lightly due to their age and lack of evidence proving they were active participants in the crime. However, because their original owner was not willing to guarantee their future good behavior, they were forfeited to Catherine du Barneau, Lady of Savigny. As for their mother, the case was pretty open and shut, with over 9 witnesses testifying against her. Their evidence was only compounded by the sow's disrespectful behavior in court. Unapologetically, she grunted, squealed, and tried to poke her nose through the bars in the prisoner's box. There were no mitigating circumstances that would have softened her punishment. After spending nearly a month in jail, she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Within days, she was publicly hanged from a tree by her hind legs alongside other condemned criminals. While this may seem like a bizarre occurrence, animal trials were fairly common in medieval and early modern France. Between the 10th and 18th centuries, over 100 animal trials took place. Sometimes a swarm of locusts would be tried for trespassing and the destruction of crops. Other times, a horse would be charged for sodomy. Overwhelmingly, though, it was pigs being tried for murder. This raises a couple of questions. Firstly, why were pigs so bloodthirsty? During the Middle Ages, it was normal to see pigs roaming free in the streets. In these rural communities, parents felt comfortable allowing their children to explore outside unattended. Unlike the large cities of today, people knew and trusted their neighbors, and there were no modern dangers such as cars to watch out for. That didn't make it entirely safe, though. As the pig trials show, danger was never as far away as it seemed. There were situations where small children would come into contact with pigs, and sometimes those pigs had a taste for human flesh. Of course, even large pigs couldn't take on fully grown adults, so their victims were usually very young. Take another infamous sow who sparked public outrage in 1567 when she snacked on a 4-month-old girl sleeping in her cot. So that's how it happened. But why did the courts even bother putting pigs through formal trials? Well, historians disagree on the reason. One popular theory is that this was how folk communities restored order after an unsettling event occurred. By reframing the unforeseeable accident as the decision of a rational actor, they could understand the tragedy and create a sense of justice. Others speculate that these public trials and executions were meant to serve as a warning to parents that they shouldn't leave their children unattended. Just like human offenders, criminal pigs were paraded around the streets in carts on the way to their executions. They were sometimes dressed in human clothes and were hanged in front of an audience. In case anybody missed the live event, they could still see the pig's corpse swaying in the wind for days after the execution. It certainly sent a message. Some scholars dismiss those theories as absurd, however, emphasizing how bizarre and cruel the whole process was. They see it as making a parody of the law, an example of humans extending their authority to every aspect of life on Earth by brute force. No matter the explanation, animal trials spread to nearby parts of Italy, Switzerland, and the Low Countries from the 15th century. But by the 18th century, animal trials were on the decline. During the Enlightenment, there was a revival in Roman law across Europe, which held that animals were not rational and so couldn't be tried for crimes. Over time, European legal systems came to resemble our modern courts, where only humans, not pigs, could be tried for murder.
Drunkard's Cloak. Weird punishments in history. During the medieval and early modern periods, the drunkard's cloak was a method of punishment, similar to the stocks for criminals and even political rebels. However, the drunkard's cloak was most commonly used as a type of public humiliation for those arrested for public intoxication. The punishment device was a large wooden barrel with 3 openings, one on top for the neck and head, and 2 on the sides for the arms. The barrel was large enough to cover the victim's entire body from his neck down to just above his ankles. Usually, the bottom of the barrel was weighted down around the neck and the lower rim in order to induce pain as well as humiliation. Once wearing the barrel, the drunk would be paraded through the streets of his town while his neighbors and friends looked on. While the drunkard's cloak, otherwise known as the Schandmantel, or the coat of shame, was first used in Germany in the 13th century, it quickly spread throughout Europe. From Germany, the drunkard's cloak spread to Holland, where it was known as the Spanish mantle, or the barrel pillory. The device then made it all the way to England, where it was known as the Newcastle cloak, or finally, the drunkard's cloak. The punishment became most popular in England after the Alehouse Act of 1551 made public drunkenness a punishable offense. This act came into being during the golden age of alehouses in England as the brewing of beer became a popular livelihood from 1550 to the 1700s, a career that was actually more popular among women. The golden age of alehouses saw the establishments become the center of good fellowship, community gatherings, and public displays of drunkenness and misbehavior. It was also believed that alehouses were not only places of drunkards and prostitutes, but also places for political subversion and the planning of uprisings, which is possibly why the Alehouse Act was actually created. In the 1650s, during the reign of Oliver Cromwell, who enforced the Alehouse Act, it was recorded through the oath of one John Willis of Ipswich that he hath seen men drove up and down the streets with a great tub or barrel opened in the sides, with a hole in one end to put through their heads, and so covered their shoulders and bodies down to the small of their legs, and then close the same, called the new-fashioned cloak, and so make them march to view of all beholders, and this is their punishment for the drunkards and the like. During this same period, the drunkard's cloak made its way over to the colonies in North America. The device survived up until the American Civil War, during which it was used to punish soldiers for crimes while they were enlisted. One such soldier was a member of the Union Army in Massachusetts who was made to declare, "I am a thief," while he was marched through all the streets of the brigade to which his regiment was attached, as a drum beat in the background. Since then, there have been a handful of recorded instances of the drunkard's cloak being used as a form of punishment in American prisons throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Cucking and ducking stools. The 13th to the 17th century. Cucking stools were popular as a type of punishment in Britain in the 13th and 14th centuries. It was used to socially humiliate people for minor infractions, like women gossiping too much, or for a tradesman found to be dishonest. The word cucking comes from the Saxon cucking stool, meaning literally defecating chair, as they were originally modified commodes, which were a covered chamber pot in a wooden seat. In the cucking stool punishment, the culprit would be paraded through their own town or village, strapped to a stool that was either carried around on planks or on a wheeled carriage. The aim was to degrade them into feeling ashamed of their actions. The ducking stool was a 16th and 17th century form of punishment derived from the earlier cucking stool. The ducking stool punishment would always end in the ducking of the guilty person in water, often repeatedly in front of a large crowd. The ducking stool was also a popular form of punishment in the new American colonies. In 1662, it was entered into the statute books of the state of Virginia in that, in the case of slander by a man's wife, if the fine was over 500 pounds of tobacco and the husband refused to pay the fine, the wife was ducked via a ducking chair, once for every 500 pounds of tobacco he refused to pay. The maximum fine under this law was 5,000 pounds of tobacco for slander. Thus, a wife could be potentially ducked up to 10 times. Dunking was a more serious version of this and was a trial by ordeal. So when a woman was suspected of being a witch, they often used dunking as a test of her guilt or innocence. The suspect was tied to a wooden or iron chair, sometimes surrounded by a simple but sturdy iron cage. The chair was attached to a long wooden beam, and the chair was then lowered into the water, which was normally a river or pond. The suspected witch was immersed in the water strapped to the chair and was left submerged for 10 to 20 seconds, and then taken out and given the opportunity to confess. This process was usually repeated until the victim either drowned or gave up and confessed. If they did confess, they were usually hanged or sometimes burnt as a witch. If they drowned, they were deemed to be innocent and their place in heaven was guaranteed. Though the preferred way of testing for a witch at that time was the swimming test, a woman suspected of being a witch was tied up and thrown into a nearby river or lake in front of a crowd. Again, if they floated, they were witches. If they sank, they were pure of heart and hopefully be dragged out of the water alive before they drowned. The last recorded case of a ducking stool being used was in 1817, when Sarah Leek was going to be ducked in the local pond. But as the water was so low, they instead just wheeled her about the town for a while in a chair. Why you wouldn't want to be the 10th Roman soldier? Decimation. Life in the Roman army was often brutal, even when not actively fighting bloodthirsty Carthaginians or rebellious gladiators. Military discipline was strict and punishments were often harsh. Soldiers caught breaking the rules could expect to face fines, flogging, or beatings, both of which were sometimes to the death. On rare occasions, however, entire units of hundreds of soldiers were subject to the most extreme penalty of all: decimation. The way in which the word decimation is used has changed over the centuries. In modern usage, it generally refers to an act of devastation or almost complete destruction. However, its Latin root word decem, meaning 10, gives a clue to its original meaning. When a Roman military unit such as a legion or cohort had committed a particularly serious offense, such as showing cowardice in the face of the enemy, its men were divided into equal groups. The soldiers were then ordered to draw lots by picking straws or picking the black stone out of a bag of white stones until 10% of the military unit had been selected. The unlucky chosen men were taken away and then beaten to death by their former comrades by stoning, clubbing, or stabbing. The remaining 9/10ths did not completely escape punishment, but were instead forced to camp away from the protection of the main encampment and to survive on barley usually only fed to animals rather than wheat rations for a period of time. It was believed that such a horrific punishment that did not discriminate between the innocent and the guilty would serve both as a corrective measure and a deterrent that would effectively keep the army as a whole in line. In the words of the Greek historian Polybius, who had first-hand experience of life on campaign with the Roman army, it was calculated to inspire fear and to correct the mischief. The earliest known examples of decimation can be found in the writings of Livy. He gives the year as 471 BC, a time when Rome was at war with the neighboring Volsci tribe. The forces of a Roman consul, Appius Claudius Sabinus Regilensis, failed to hold their battle lines, broke formation, and fled. In the ensuing chaos, the rear guard was routed, and both weapons and standards were abandoned. Appius had standard bearers, centurions, and any soldier without a weapon scourged and then beheaded. The remaining men were then decimated. Another famous instance of decimation occurred in 72 BC, when Rome and all of Italia were terrorized by a slave revolt led by Spartacus. The Senate awarded the command of several legions in Italia to Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputedly the richest man in Rome and certainly one of its most powerful. Crassus placed 2 of his legions under the command of the legate Mummius and gave him explicit orders not to directly engage with Spartacus's slave army. Mummius, however, disobeyed these orders, and his soldiers suffered yet another defeat at the hands of the slaves. Once again, some men fled the battle, discarding their weapons as they ran. Accounts vary as to what happened next. The bloodiest suggest that Crassus's decimation resulted in 1,000 men being put to death. But the most conservative claims that the number of casualties was substantially less, and that only 500 soldiers in total were decimated by their fellow soldiers. Decimation had not been used for many years until Crassus revived it, possibly because it would draw attention away from Spartacus. Despite their earlier defeat and the horrific punishment they received for it, the remainder of Crassus's force were able to rally and decisively put down the uprising. In fact, the Greek historian Appian commented that Crassus's use of decimation was an encouragement for the troops, as it taught them that they had more to fear from their commander than they did from the enemy. The Greek writer Plutarch claimed that Crassus's use of decimation resulted in many things horrible and dreadful to see, and that by carrying out such a sentence he was reviving an ancient mode of punishing the soldiers. However, there are relatively few extant examples of decimation found in ancient sources. It could have been effective in the short term, but in reality, it resulted in a wasteful destruction of manpower and could easily have been counterproductive to the morale of the legions. Decimation started to carry a particular mystique as time wore on, and many ancient authors were fond of invoking it in their commentaries on Roman history. For example, Julius Caesar threatened his 9th Legion, Hispania, with decimation in 49 BC when they mutinied over pay and conditions. However, most historians agree that the decimation never actually took place. This hasn't stopped the myth of the decimation of the 9th Legion from being perpetuated ever since. In any case, Caesar was much more fond of mercy and clemency towards fellow Romans and was an indulgent commander who rarely missed an opportunity to share the spoils of war with his loyal troops. The last known use of decimation by a Roman leader came in 363 AD, when the Emperor Julian was fighting in Persia. 3 units of cavalry scouts were ambushed, some troopers had fled, one commanding officer was slain, and a Roman standard was captured. Julian had 10 of the men who had run away executed in accord with the ancient laws. This example of a much reduced case of decimation is perhaps evidence of its infrequent use during the Roman Empire. It's also possible that Romans of Emperor Julian's time no longer fully understood the practice of decimation, or more likely, that while the emperor wished to make an example out of a handful of soldiers, he also kept in mind the ongoing campaign in Persia. The Romans kept alive the idea of decimation, as they did with so many arcane, half-forgotten aspects of religion, because they were so reluctant to do away with tradition. Rome's most ancient laws, the honoring of the gods, and their much-cherished traditions, were what Romans in public life held most dear.
Life under the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, famine, and S-21, 1975 to 1979. When the Vietnamese army captured Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, from the Khmer Rouge in 1979, they found the city in a terrible state, and among the horrors they came across was a former high school that had been turned into a prison and was known as Security Prison 21, or just S-21. The dark buildings were enclosed in electrified barbed wire, and iron bars covered all the windows. The prisoners included academics, doctors, monks, students, and their teachers, as well as factory workers and engineers. All were accused of being enemies of the regime and tortured and forced to name their friends and family members as co-conspirators. Whole families were often brought in together to be interrogated and executed. Ultimately, paranoia meant that the regime began to turn on itself, and the cells were soon filled with party activists and their families, and even high-ranking politicians. At least 18,145 people had been imprisoned there, and all but a handful had been executed. S-21 was only one of more than 150 torture and execution centers established by the Khmer Rouge. Today, it stands as a memorial to the lives lost and to the brutality that they inflicted upon the people of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was the name given to the members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the CPK, who ruled Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. They were led by the infamous Pol Pot, who attempted to purify Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. This led to one of the worst cases of genocide in history. Influenced by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward in China, Pol Pot imagined his own super Great Leap Forward in Cambodia. After seizing power in a civil war in 1975, the CPK wanted to rapidly build the country under their own vision. Pol Pot compared the Cambodian revolution with those in China, Korea, and Vietnam, and proclaimed that no revolution would be as fast as his. Indeed, the CPK was obsessed with speed, and many in the party were paranoid that they would be replaced, and believed the faster their plans could be achieved, the safer they would be. The Super Great Leap was to be achieved independent of any foreign aid, through independent self-mastery. Khmer Rouge theorists believe that an initial period of self-imposed economic isolation would stimulate the rebirth of the crafts and the country's industrial capability. In order to follow this policy of extreme self-reliance, the CPK announced a 4-year plan to triple the country's rice production. However, Cambodia had suffered severely during the Civil War. Almost 3/4 of the draft animals needed to plow the fields had been killed, and by 1975, rice production had dropped by 84%. Such a rapid increase in production was impossible, but Pol Pot believed this was merely a matter of revolutionary willpower and instituted his policy of agricultural offenses, including a nationwide system of forced labor. He believed that achieving his economic goals would be as simple as winning the Civil War. The army and the CPK's agricultural warfare were the people, and manual labor was the key to victory. The purpose of every Cambodian was to work and advance the revolution. Villages were reorganized into cooperatives, and thousands of city dwellers were forced out of their homes to work on the farms. As a result of this policy, workers of all ages were forced to do 10 to 14 hours of hard labor per day in unsustainable conditions. Often, survivors reported working late into the night, particularly during harvest time, surrounded by encouraging slogans urging them to pledge to sacrifice your life to accomplish Angar's work, or to stay on the worksite until death. A lot of food was needed to feed all these productive farmers. However, rice was also needed for Pol Pot's economic goals, so large amounts of rice were extracted from the population for party use and export. The CPK provided nothing in return. Fareth, one survivor of the period, recalled that she was assigned to a children's work unit when she was 11 years old. Fareth was ordered to carry soil, dig trenches, and help build a local dam. She and her unit lived at the work site, sleeping under a rough shelter made out of palm leaves. The dam was considered a highly important project for the revolution, and her unit were given a comparatively extravagant food ration of 2 daily portions of rice and salt and sometimes fish soup. Still, Fareth was constantly hungry and exhausted, as even such plentiful rations were not sufficient to sustain such hard labor. When her unit had finished at the worksite 3 months later, the local officials held a celebration to commemorate the occasion. The celebration included a play, revolutionary songs, and a mass marriage ceremony. The young Fareth says she was personally praised for her hard work and felt so proud of herself. It was only later that Fareth learned about what happened to her 2 younger sisters during this time. Her grandmother had been placed in charge of them because she was too old to work. She was starving and grew too weak to look after the girls. Without someone to care for them, the little girls were so hungry that they became ill and died of starvation. Meanwhile, absolute socialism meant that all natural resources were the property of the state, and any signs of individualism or privatism were banned, including private gardens, private ownership of foodstuffs, and even the act of cooking privately, which was punishable by imprisonment and execution. The people were not even allowed to forage for food in the countryside. After Fareth's little sisters had died, her grandmother survived on a small amount of hidden medicine. However, the Khmer Rouge searched the village every 3 days, looking for so-called contraband, including cooking equipment and rice. The small stash of medicine was found and confiscated, along with the family's only cooking pot, by local Khmer Rouge cadres. Fareth's grandmother refused to suffer this final indignity, and within a week she succumbed to a combination of illness and starvation and passed away. Although the situation rapidly deteriorated into a full-blown famine, Pol Pot continued to talk about agriculture as a military operation, and he saw enemies everywhere. In his mind, any shortfalls in production were the fault of saboteurs and ideological enemies. Anybody who criticized the CPK's policies was branded an enemy of the state and was arrested, tortured, and executed. While the farmers starved, the CPK continued to make thousands of arrests with those who it believed to be enemies or a threat to the state. Many experienced doctors were executed or hid their profession because any sign of a privileged or urban background, including education or professional training, were viewed with extreme suspicion by the Khmer Rouge and created a high risk of execution if discovered. Indeed, this led to a lack of medicine and healthcare at a time when many of the nation's workers were sickly and starving. Instead of seeking a solution, the Khmer Rouge mocked its victims. The suspicious CPK accused overworked and underfed workers of feigning illness to avoid work, saying those that were starving had caught an imaginary disease. CPK's slogan said that we must wipe out all those who imagine they are ill and expel them from our society. There was no respite for the exhausted, starving, and sickly population, and many victims simply just gave up and collapsed and died. Utilizing its secret police, the Khmer Rouge rounded up, tortured, and executed anybody who was seen as an enemy. This also included all foreigners and ethnic minorities, those with connections to the previous Cambodian government, professionals and intellectuals, including anybody who had an education or understood a foreign language, and party members who had fallen foul of the regime. Innocent men, women, and children, even newborn babies, were brought to prisons like S21 and coerced into confessing for imaginary crimes and providing the names of other alleged enemies of the state. For 12 days and nights, an engineer called Chumme was tortured at S21. His tormentors whipped him with bamboo sticks and broke his fingers when he tried to shield himself. They shackled his legs and removed his toenails with pliers. Chumme was also subjected to electric shocks, which he feared the most. Electrodes were placed inside of his ears and the shocks deafened him. He said that he felt as though his eyes were on fire and he was ready to tell them everything they wanted to hear. The interrogators forced him to sign a false confession that he was working for the CIA and had recruited other men and women. The dozens of innocent acquaintances that he had named were also arrested, tortured, and murdered. Chumme had never heard of the CIA and never found out why he had been arrested. He was one of the few who actually survived their stay at S21. Most foreigners had left the country before the end of the Civil War, but several were imprisoned at S21, including the 26-year-old British teacher, John Dawson DeWorst. John was traveling the hippie trail to visit his friend in Malaysia when he met the owners of a small yacht, a Canadian, Stuart Glass, and a New Zealander, Kerry Hamill. They decided to sail north along the Thai coast toward Bangkok, when somehow the three men found themselves in Cambodian waters and their boat was seized by a revolutionary patrol boat. Stuart was shot dead immediately, while John and Kerry were taken to the infamous Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh. The men were undoubtedly tortured, and records show that John had written a confession that mixed the true events of his life with false accounts about his life as a CIA agent. After confessing, most inmates were brought to one of several sites known as the Killing Fields. In the 4 years of the CPK's rule, more than 1 million people were executed and buried in mass graves at these places. Khmer Rouge soldiers, young men or women usually taken from peasant families, would then execute their victims using brutal and horrific methods, such as poison or literally beating them to death. In some cases, they even made their victims dig their own graves first as a final insult. To this day, their remains are still being uncovered at the Killing Fields. Starvation and executions under the Khmer Rouge were responsible for around 1.5 to 2 million deaths, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population at that time. After the Vietnamese seized Phnom Penh in 1979, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge fled into Thailand to wage a guerrilla war. Support for the CPK gradually waned and the Khmer Rouge became less powerful and disbanded. Pol Pot died of a heart attack in 1998. In the final interview before his death, he said that his conscience was clear and everything he had done for his country.